Part 1. The Spore. It is a dark time for the universe. A mysterious infection that imitates normal life has swept most systems in the sick confederation of intelligent civilizations. The infection spreads so quietly that it only becomes apparent that a planet was infected once most of the population was infected. At that point, all the infected would transform in horrific amalgamations of the planets, wildlife, and assimilate all who remain untouched. The government of the sick quickly collapsed as the infection ravaged most of its population. Even those that remained heavily mistrusted each other, and all the infection's survivors died in a resulting civil war. All except those on planet Proxima. Thanks to quick and decisive action by the rulers of the planet remained isolated and uninfected. That was until rumors of an outbreak in the planet's capital caused a planet-wide frenzy. In fear of their planet being overrun by things, the leaders of the planet launched several spore spaceships with the goal of landing on a habitable, uninhabited planet and restarting civilization. Panel stared out of the window of the ship. Even though he saw stars slowly drift across the window, he still knew they were traveling at incredible speeds. One of the few advantages of this old thing, he thought. He always compared the ship to the ones he had been on during his service to the sick military. It was a shame planet Centurns was overrun by those things. They made the fastest ships in the galaxy. It's a shame all those planets were overrun. Panel would focus his gaze on a specific star and watch it drift through the darkness until it reached his reflection in the window, at which point his three eyes would focus on himself for a second, until he saw another star to focus on. He thought about how most of those planets were once teeming with life, but now were in ruins and covered in the corpses of starving monsters who were responsible for the planet's destruction. His thoughts went back to Proxima. It had been 42 PRS Proxima rotations, which are around 3 hours each, since he had told his crew that they had lost communications with Proxima and the other spore ships. The announcement significantly worsened the already dire mood on board, since most of the crew had family back on Proxima, though it seems like all of them silently accepted the truth that they would never see them again, and they soon returned to their duties on board. Being commander of the Spore 2891 panel was the only one allowed to communicate with Proxima. Over the last communications, the ones he spoke became more and more paranoid, and they transmitted harrowing news articles about their fight against the infection. Entire cities were reduced to atoms by antimatter weapons once even just a couple infections were confirmed there. The cities panel grew up in, worked in, went on holidays in were all now gone. He knew that if he gave speeches to his crew to keep it together in these dire times, he had to as well, yet his mind always seemed to wander back to the beautiful mountains of his home city, which now no longer exist. The final communication he received from Proxima was unlike the hopeless ones that preceded it, one of celebration. According to the voice on the other end, the last couple infected cities were destroyed, and the planet was safe to return to. Panel received explicit instructions before Spore 2891's launch that he would never receive instructions to return, and that, if he did, he had to destroy/disable the communicator. And so once receiving the last transmission, he cut the communicator's wire and told the crew that their ship was now out of range of Proxima to send and receive signals. Panel knew that lying to his crew was against his personal morals, but he also knew now was not the time for morals. It wasn't the time for morals for a long while. His only comfort was that everyone seemed to not believe him, yet soon realized why he must be lying. By the time he had cut the wires, they had already lost communication with every other spore ship. They were all truly out of range, or their crew were decimated by things that snuck on board. Panel couldn't help but dread what had happened to the ones out of range. Their ship was incredibly lucky. Panel reached for his gadget, a small circular information device, which was magnetically attached to his belt with his gloved six-fingered hand. He checked the time. His gadget, among other things, counted the number of PRS since launch. Since he saw they were at 122 PR since launch, he decided to go. He turned from the window and looked around the control room. The room had 4 walls. One was the massive, curved window behind Panel. The 2 adjacent to the window were flat and metallic. each with a door leading to the kitchen and the observatory respectively. The wall opposite to the window was also metallic, but was curved inwards, and had no door. All 10 rooms on the ship had this strange yet standard to Proxima design, since the whole ship was circular and the center contained the also circular engine room, inaccessible to all except the engineer. In the center of the room stood a chair with a circular screen in front of it. The screen had access to all the ship's controls, but was currently turned off. The screen could only turn on once it read the ship's commander panel's forehead print. In the corner of the room, panel saw maps, the ship's navigator, using a larger gadget. It was standard practice in Proxima culture to address everyone by nicknames their peers had given them. Maps was nicknamed Maps because it was all he seemed interested in. "How long have you been here?" Panel asked, annoyed that he thought he was alone. "I've been here since before you came," Maps said in a disinterested tone, not even bothering to look up from his gadget. Panel was so nicknamed because he had the habit of always staring out of windows/glass panels into space, yet he always preferred to do it alone and in quiet. He went over to see the screen of Maps' gadget, which was filled diagrams, readings and observations from the local star systems, all to improve the ship's route, all useful to the mission, so he couldn't get angry. Panel set off to the opposite side of the ship. What he wanted to do could be done remotely via gadget, but with mistrust for nearly everything growing in these strange and horrific times, so too did his mistrust for remote communication grow. He decided arbitrarily to take the anti-clockwise route to the opposite of the ship. He opened the door to the kitchen and walked through to see 4 of his crew waiting for him. Gadget was near the cupboards, but instead of making food like he had to, he was, as always, Panel grumpily thought, fiddling on his gadget. Panel had his objections to giving Gadget his nickname. He said it would cause confusion, but he could not deny that it was accurate to what Gadget was always occupied with. At least Maps drew physical diagrams every now and then, and was doing something productive for the mission. "Prepare our food, Gadget," Panel ordered. Gadget immediately complied and started taking food out of the cupboards to make the crew their meal. In the center of the room sat Lights and Ice. With a table between them, they were playing a board game. Lights was the computer engineer, so nicknamed because of the strange, yet admittedly beautiful light display. He rigged up back on Proxima. Best not to think about some of the nickname's origins, Panel thought. Lights was intelligent, no denying that. If your gadget or computer weren't working, he could fix them in a couple presses of the touchscreen or a couple wires fixed on the inside. Lights was also very. Panel liked to use the word arrogant, but most of the crew would describe him as funny. Most of the crew liked him, so Panel tries to ignore his apparent arrogance. Ice was the historian, preserver of the continuum of the knowledge, culture and history of Proxima is how he would put it. What he actually did was a mystery. Everything about him had an air of mystery. The clothes he wore, why his hands were always cold to touch, which was why he was nicknamed Ice, and why Panel was continually reassured of Ice's intelligence before the launch. Ice and Lights were playing a classic board game, which simulated a space battle, which would seem inappropriate in these times, but as Panel was always quick to mention, the game was far from reality and well, they needed a fun distraction in these very times. Panel could see they were reaching the end game of their game. Both sat in silence, focusing completely on the game, both trying to outwit the other. Lights finally made his move while Panel walked past. He moved his gunner halfway across the hexagonal board, trapping Ice's flagship in an unwinnable position. He had won. Panel stopped for a moment to see what Ice's reaction would be to defeat. Would he be angry, sad, in denial, or something else? While Lights was clearly very happy, saying something to the effect of focus on the details, not just the main prize, with that arrogant look on his face, Ice was quiet for a moment until Ice finally said, "You got me good. Good game," as he himself walked off, leaving Lights more confused than happy from his victory. As Panel walked out of the kitchen, he saw Scorch, the ship's security guard, sitting in the corner. Scorch probably opened his mouth about 12 times throughout their trip so far. Scorch spent most of his time in the corner, listening to the crew talk, Scorch probably always knew the locations of most of the crew members. Magnetically attached to Scorch's belt was the two parts of his burner, after which he was nicknamed. A burner is the standard weapon used on Proxima. It has two parts, a cartridge and cannon. The cartridge contains flammable liquid, and once it's combined with the cannon can shoot small hot droplets of the flammable liquid, which sets the target on fire. Panel entered the tool room. It was filled with tools and machines that this Stone, the engineer, would fix things with. And now he was supposed to be working, but he was nowhere to be seen. The ship was so cobbled together that it seemed like he always had something to fix. Had Panel missed something? He took out his gadget again to see if he had any messages. While lamenting the fact that his gadget always turned off, after a while, he made a mental note to ask Lights about it. No messages from Stone. He almost tripped on one of the tools Stone had dropped on the floor. He also thought he should ask Stone to clean the area up a bit later, and continued to the medical room. Inside was Sneaks, who sitting on one of the beds talking to Claw. Sneaks was the astronomer and geologist of the ship. He studied local stars and especially planets to look for signs of habitability. He was smaller than average, and Panel assumed he could, because of that fact, more easily sneak around, which is why he got his nickname. Panel could see that his skin was a darker shade of blue than normal, which is probably why he was at the medical room at the time. Nothing to worry about, Claw said in a reassuring tone. Claw was the doctor of their ship, and his nickname's intimidating tone couldn't be further from the truth. Claw was named after the medical tools and instruments he used to treat the crew of the ship. He was always friendly, but still understood the importance of the mission he was on. Panel walked past them and continued to the greenhouse. The greenhouse was filled with many spherical transparent pods containing many samples of Proxima's flora. Each pod was adjusted to simulate the environments of the various plants. For example, the pod containing the blue root was kept at low pressure, since blue root grew on the mountains, while the pod containing the landweeds were moisturized as they grew on the beaches. Breeze was walking between the rows of pods checking their vitals to make sure everything was all right with them. Breeze was the botanist of the ship. He was either nicknamed Breeze because of his over-positive attitude or his love of plants. Breeze greeted Panel friendly as Panel walked to his destination, the animal habitat. The room was filled with transparent pods containing individual animals. Lining the walls were large empty boxes. Inside their bottoms were coated with soil, to simulate the ground of Proxima. There were also large fridges, containing the animals' foods. At a small chair and table sat Holes, the zoologist of the ship. Holes was often bit by the animals he worked with, so he always had a couple scars or holes on his skin. Holes was watching Stone, the engineer, work on some wires in an open panel on the engine side of the room. It's been a little over 120 PR since launch. You can put the animals in their boxes, Panel said to Holes. They were instructed to keep all the animals quarantined in their own pods for 120 PR after launch in case one of them were infected. Holes initially protested the instruction, calling it cruel, and he even rightly pointed out that they had a fully functioning thing testing device that came back negative for all the animals. Panel simply reminded him that orders are orders. Testing devices looked like gadgets, but had a hole on top of them. You would stick your finger into the device, would take an insignificant sample of your skin tissue and expose it to extreme heat. If it detected no resistance, it would shine a red light, else a blue one. Panel looked at the tester that lay inside the open cupboard in the table Holes was now standing up from. He thought that the quarantine really was unnecessary, but orders are still orders. Holes walked to the pods containing the animals and placed them in their respective boxes where they could finally interact with members of their own species. There were 7 animal species on board. There were the aquatic willows, small round creatures who are completely covered in massive red tentacles, which moved around on the ocean floor by pulling themselves via said tentacles. Then there were the kazils, creatures about the size of the Proximian's hands. They had a hexagonal body with a leg protruding from each side. They also had 2 long eyes on the top of their body. Then there were the munkrats, who almost looked like the intelligent Proximians, but were shorter, less intelligent, had large front teeth and had hands, with only 3 massive fingers. Breeze and Holes debated whether or not to keep the Stickles in the greenhouse or animal habitat. Holes won when he pointed out that while the Stickles couldn't move, and had a resemblance to a large flower, it was still carnivorous, and had teeth lining the inside of their mouths on top of their body. The Afrals were also debated, but not for as long. They were medium-sized animals who burrowed into the ground and would bite unsuspecting victims who stepped on them with their disproportionately large mouths. Once Holes had transferred those 5 groups of animals into their boxes, he sighed and moved to transfer the animals, inhabiting the dirtiest pods of them all, the Voltives. Voltives were long and thin animals with many tiny legs they would move around with. Though they were long and thin, they moved around upright, and in the wild, when they saw a dead carcass or plant they wanted to eat, they would vomit acid on it to dissolve and then eat it. Once he was done transferring the Voltives and cleaning himself off, he moved on to the last group of animals, the Gospons, aquatic creatures who looked like 2 attached circles, who would wait on the seafloor, then catch small fish, swimming above with their long tongues, and pull them towards themselves to wrap themselves around them and digest them. Holes completed transferring the Gospons into their box. He sat on his chair exhausted. "I won't be done for a while," sighed Stone, who was still working on the wires all the while. Stone was the tallest and presumably physically strongest of the crew, which is why he got his nickname. He was built like a stone. He was more than fit for the physically demanding job, which was engineer. "Oh, I should feed them," Holes said, suddenly getting up. He walked over to the fridge and took out a bag of frozen pieces kinnel meat. Kinnels were fish which lived in the caves of Proxima. Unfortunately, since the Spore 2891 had such a rushed launch in order to minimize risk of crew infection, that they couldn't get live kinnels in time. Panel wondered how many more species would go extinct just because they couldn't make it onto the ship. All the animals were either omnivores or carnivores, so Holes could feed the kinnel to them all. "I'm going back to the control room. See you both at lunch," Panel said. They both greeted him as he exited. Panel decided to walk back to the control room via the other side of the ship, in order to check on the rest of the crew. He walked from the animal habitat to the incubator, what was perhaps the most important room of them all. The room containing many eggs of the crew's species that they would hatch once they reached their destination, a habitable planet which was the 3rd closest to its star. As Panel entered, Twitch, proving why he was nicknamed such, jumped with fright. Twitch managed the eggs, which were lined up in rows inside massive climate-controlled pods. Despite Twitch's timidness, he was very good at his essential job. He oversaw managing the yet-to-be-hatched eggs. The eggs had to be kept at relatively high temperatures, so they were heated via the same liquid, in Panel and Scorcher's burners in pipes under the pods, so there would always be a risk of fire or overheating, but thanks to Twitch that risk was near zero. Panel simply greeted Twitch and continued back to the control room. Panel walked through the computer room, the airlock room, and finally the observatory to get back to the control room. All 3 of those rooms were empty, which was to be expected. Lights, who was supposed to work in the computer room, was taking a break in the kitchen, and Sneaks, who had to work in the observatory, may still be in the medical room, plus nobody was assigned to the airlock room for obvious reasons. Panel spent much of the following time staring out of the window. After 122 PRS, boredom was starting to set in, Panel thought. His gadget suddenly buzzed. It was Gadget saying that it was lunchtime. Panel walked in to see the whole crew, except Holes and Stone, starting to put food in their bowls. He figured they were still on their way. No matter the quality of the meal, lunchtime was always a bit tense, a moment when they were all without the distractions from the horror which permeated the whole universe at this time. They still talked, still occasionally laughed, but they avoided any mention of Proxima or things or the infection which created them or the purpose of the mission they were on or anything like that. Despite some of the crew knowing each other, for years their conversations were surface level and shallow, to hide the darkest beneath. Right now, Most were talking about how they just had a couple PRS before reaching their destination. After a while of eating, Panel realized that Stone and Holes still weren't back, so he walked to the animal habitat to check on them. When he entered, the room was dark, which was to be expected. The room darkened every 0.5 PRS to simulate the Proxima day/night cycle and to not distress the animals. The only light was that of Stone's gadget, who was still at work on the panel of wires is the wall. "Hey, it's been lunchtime for a while, you can finish that later, unless that's urgent, Stone." Panel said to them, "No, not urgent, not yet, I'm almost done, I'll finish after lunch. I do really need the food to concentrate, one misplaced wire here, and the whole ship's power could be cut." Stone said while exiting the room. "Hey Holes, are you coming?" Panel asked Holes, who was still in the room staring at one of the boxes. "Yeah," he replied while following the other two. When they returned to the kitchen, Stone was speaking to Lights about the issue with the wires, some extremely technical problem Panel had no hope of comprehending. Panel saw Holes in the corner alone, barely touching his food. Something was bothering him. Once Panel finished his food, he went over to Holes to ask what was wrong, leaving his gadget on the table. One of the Kazils, those little creatures with the 6 legs, was still walking after the lights went out. Holes said wearily, "Why?" Panel asked, "Was it perhaps the light from Stone's gadget?" "Couldn't have been," Holes replied. "None of the others were walking around. Strangest of all, it was almost like it was only walking when I wasn't really looking." Panel thought for a moment, anxiety slowly rising in him. Could it possibly be minus? Panel was cut off. "No. All the animals were tested," Holes shouted. Panel thought for another moment. "Kinnels are fish that live in caves, so they have night vision, right? Was the kinnel meat tested?" he asked. Holes was silent. Panel, unsure if he had properly heard him, repeated, "Was the kinnel meat tested?" His anxiety was reaching levels so high he couldn't hide it properly anymore. "Was it?" he blurted out, yet Hole's terrified expression was answer enough. Panel jumped up out of his seat and, as if in response, the pained roars of a Munkrat echoed throughout the ship before transforming mid-roar into a more painful, distorted version of itself. Their ship had a thing on board. All the other crew jumped out of their seats, some confused, most scarred. "I have just found out that one of the Kazils on board have been infected and is assimilating the other animals," Panel said. "We have a clear protocol in case something like this happened. We are always to all stay in a group unless that poses some sort of risk. We are also to try and eliminate the thing threat as fast as possible. We are all going to go to the animal habitat now. Me and Scorch are going to try to neutralize those things minus." He was cut off by Sneaks. "There's no way we're going, we're unarmed." Lights then said, "I'm not staying alone with those 2 Sneaks. Didn't Stone and Holes just come from the habitat? How do we know they weren't minus? Are you accusing us?" Stone said, both in a shocked and angry tone. Lights opened his mouth to speak, but Panel shouted, "All right." And everyone went silent. The only sound now that remained was the quiet rumbling coming from the opposite of the ship. "We are in extreme danger at this point, and we cannot devolve into arguments now. Holes is the reason I know there is a thing, so he is clear. Stone was with him, so him too. And as for you Sneaks, we have strength in numbers, must and always keep track of all the crew, so that none of us can be isolated and assimilated. You all will stand behind me and Scorch for safety. You are all to follow my every command no matter what. Now let's kill this thing before it tears the ship apart." Sneaks and Lights looked like they wanted to interrupt at several points, but Panel talked so authoritatively that at the end, they simply nodded their heads and started following him and Scorch along with the rest of the crew. The crew walked counterclockwise towards the habitat in complete silence. The only sound they heard was the rumbling and distorted roaring emanating from the habitat, growing ever louder and louder with every step they took. When they finally reached the habitat, the door was closed. Panel stepped forward and opened the door. putrid smell hit their senses. It smelled like a cross between rotting carcass and what smelled like oil. Inside they could see the boxes and pods smashed, liquid with the familiar color of their animals. Bodily fluid covered nearly every surface, and the roaring, which they were listening to the whole time, grew louder and was now so distorted, it could not be mistaken for the cry of a pure, uncorrupted, natural creature. "Scorch, you walk behind me, everyone else behind Scorch," ordered Panel while arming his burner. Nobody dared to disobey him, everyone followed him inside the room. The rest of the room looked the same as the glimpse they saw earlier, but the table Holes was sitting at earlier was intact, up against the wall where it had been when they left. But none of the crew were focusing on any aspect of the room other than what sat in its center, for what sat in the center was beyond description, beyond comparison to anything the 12 crew had ever seen in their entire lives. In the center of the room, there was a fleshy orange and red blob about their size with a large appendage sticking out on top of its body. In front of it was a munkrat on the floor completely covered, and encased in the red tentacles of a willow. The munkrat was silently yet desperately trying to break free from the restrictive tentacles. Suddenly it started getting dragged back to the blob behind it, from which the tentacles grew. The munkrat started thrashing around trying one last time to break free, but it couldn't even manage to open its mouth to make a final pained cry. The munkrat was dragged back into the blob behind it. The blob then started absorbing it. The munkrat's thrashing grew weaker and weaker the more of it was consumed by the blob, until all that remained of it was its two hands sticking out of the blob, at uneven angles. The blob seemingly realized that it was no longer alone, as it gave a deafening, intimidating roar from the appendage on top of its body, which looked like a cross between a stickle and a vaultive body. 6 oversized consile legs suddenly grew from its body, allowing it to stand. Many willow tentacles sprung from the munkrat hand and the blob's body. It was a nightmarish amalgamation of all the ship's animal life, ready to attack. Panel decided that he had waited too long now. He pushed the button on his burner. The drop of hot liquid flew through air at the speed of a falling object ready to ignite its target. But before it could arrive, the thing, by some force proximas scientists were innocent enough not to understand, propelled itself off the ground, dodging the projectile and sticking to the roof. Panel shot at the thing a couple times more, but it dodged the shots while crawling across the roof to the back of the room. Panel started thinking quickly. He didn't want to get near it in fear of his own and his crew's safety. He might have to in order to get the perfect shot. Maybe he could. The thunderous, ear-splitting sound of electricity suddenly filled the room. Along with blinding white flashing light, the smell of carcass and oil reached its most unbearable. The thing had stuck one of its legs into the open panel of wires Stone had left open. It squirmed, clearly not expecting the results of sticking its leg in there. It quickly detached the leg, but the onslaught of lights and sounds coming from the panel didn't stop. After a couple seconds, the noise stopped, along with the ship's lights. The power was off. Panel took a deep breath and tried to ignore the gasps of his crew so that he could think. He felt his belt. It was empty. He had left his gadget in the kitchen. The only source of light was his burner. He then became conscious to the persistent tapping he heard coming from the roof, so he aimed to the spot where he vaguely thought the thing might be and shot. The shot temporarily lit up that spot of the roof, but he couldn't see it. It was clearly moving to confuse him since it had night vision. Panel thought for the little seconds it had night vision. They didn't. It was moving towards them. They were all together. The tapping grew louder. He heard a couple of the crew behind him run off. If he started firing at random, there would be risk of hitting a crew member. There was only one correct choice. Run. Hide. Panel shouted. With no hesitation they all obeyed. If they were all scattered across the ship, it would take a while for the thing to get to all of them. This bought him and Scorch valuable time to prepare an offensive. Now Panel was running from the habitat in the clockwise direction around the ship. His only priority was to off-course neutralize the thing, but he couldn't do that without light. He had no idea where Stone was, but he knew it would take him too long to fix the power anyways. Panel was on his way back to the kitchen where they had left their gadgets. Then he would have light, and the thing would lose its advantage. He knew the ship well enough to make it all the way to the tool room while blindly running. Once he entered the tool room, he tripped on a tool left on the floor. "Who goes there?" A weary voice on the other side of the room. "Stone. Is that you?" "It's me, Panel, hold on." Panel ran into the kitchen, grabbed 2 gadgets and ran back to give one to Stone. "Use this as light. Bring the power back as fast as possible. Every second without light is a second it has an advantage." He had light now for the thing itself. Panel switched on his gadget and put it on his belt. It didn't provide a lot of light, but enough. He looked through the door to the medical room. He could see a couple people hiding under the beds in the medical room. Past them he could see the open door to the greenhouse, and in the greenhouse he finally saw it, the thing. They seemed to notice each other. At the same time, the thing started crawling towards him. Its neck-like appendage on top of its body looked impatient as it leaned forwards towards Panel. Panel was already in the dark, and he already knew the thing could dodge the droplets from a distance. He needed to get closer to it. He realized that the thing might spot one of the crew under the beds, so he fired a shot at it. He didn't expect it to hit, and it didn't. He just wanted it to just focus on him. If it was smart enough to realize the importance of the open panel of wires earlier, then it was smart enough to recognize him as the leader of the crew, or at least smart enough to recognize him as a threat. Panel started backing up. While he still wanted to get close, he wanted it to follow him away from the crew. He carefully inched backwards. He wanted to make it to the control room. "Keep working," Panel said calmly as the thing entered the tool room. As Panel walked backwards into the control room, he didn't lift his eyes off the thing, and he had a feeling it wasn't either. He was walking a little slower than it so that he could subtly close the distance between them and get the perfect shot lined up. When they finally reached the control room, he realized that this was his. The light from his gadget suddenly went off. He forgot that it automatically switched off. He heard some sort of gurgling sound. Pure instinct take over. Press the button on the burner, while Light's words from earlier echoed through his mind. Focus on the details, not just the main prize. For a split second the burner illuminated itself, and a blob of white liquid coming towards it. The blob hit the burner, and instantly extinguished the yet-to-be-fired projectile while covering Panel's hands in the acidic liquid. It burned like fire. Without thinking, Panel dropped the burner and flung his gloves off. As they were coated in the liquid, they even felt like they already had holes in them. He quickly wiped his hands off on his clothes. He had no doubt that a bit of the infection was in that liquid and that his hands were now contaminated. He had minutes, if he was lucky, before the infection took over, but he was not worrying about that now. He grabbed his gadget on his belt and activated its light, revealed the thing standing 2 arm lengths away, with that disgusting liquid dripping out of its mouth. On the end of its neck, Panel could finally see the teeth of the Afrals and the tongue of the Gospons in its mouth. The thing had picked up his burner with its munkrat hand and now smashed it in between its 3 fingers, spilling the burner liquid on itself, the floor and Panel. Before the thing had the chance to lunge at him, Panel, in a split-second decision, he threw the gadget in his hand at the floor with all the force he could muster. The moment it hit the ground, the sheer force of impact split it open, exposing a live wire to the flammable liquid. Almost instantly the liquid went up in flames and the fire quickly spread to both Panel and the thing. Panel fell on the floor to try to roll to put the fire out, but it was already too late. The last thing Panel saw was the thing in flames dully falling to the floor. Part 2. The Imposter. After the pain distorted roar subsided, the only sound that echoed throughout the ship was that of Stone working on the power. After a couple minutes the lights finally returned and Stone investigated what had happened in the control room. He shouted for the rest of the crew to come to the control room. When they all arrived, they found Stone on the floor, devastated. In front of him was a pile of ash in the familiar form of one of their own. Across from both near the window was a larger pile of ash with 4 thin ashen things sticking out of it and 1 thick one, the clear figure of their former terrorizer. They all stood around Stone and Panel's corpse. "What happens now?" Sneaks asked. "Protocol dictates we vote for a new leader now." Lights replied. "The leader of our mission to preserve Proximian civilization just died to save us. Can we just mourn him for a moment?" and not immediately replace him. Ice said with sadness and contempt. We need a new leader, and quick, said Holes, standing closer to the ashen remains of the thing, staring at it. Holes turned to look at the rest of the group. One of us is a thing. Everyone looked shocked. Stone got up and looked at him. We can't just jump to baseless accusations. He shouted. What evidence do you even have? Gadget added. This corpse here has 4 legs. Holes responded. Everyone walked over to look at what remained of the thing. I see 5. Said Maps. That thick one was its neck. Holes responded. So what if it only had 4 legs? Asked Claw. You see, it started with 6, Holes said. It stuck one in that panel shutting off the power, but it was able to detach it. We know every part of the things is a whole. When the lights went out, it probably detached another leg, then he was cut off by Twitch. It could have gotten to any one of us. The atmosphere had always been dire on their mission, but it was nothing compared to how they all felt now. Everyone backed away slowly, moving away from each other. Everyone looked around nervously. Claw was visibly shaking. Do we still have the... He stuttered. Do we still have the tester? Breeze asked for him. Yeah, it's in the cupboard in the habitat. Answered Holes. More silence followed the mention of the habitat. Well then, let's go get it. Stop this monster among us before it tears us apart. Light said. Nobody wanted to go back to habitat, but everyone wanted to find the tester. When they arrived, the room was still stained with the previous violence it was subjected to. Everyone carefully stepped past the splotches of animal fluid on the floor to get to the cupboard next to the back wall of the room. The cupboard looked unscathed, perhaps because it didn't contain a living thing to assimilate. Everyone stood together as Holes opened the cupboard, and behind him Breeze gasped. It was empty. Everyone spread out around the room, scared to even stand next to each other. What is happening? We were clean, we were safe. Wire minus, Claw shouted before being cut off by Twitch. I knew one you were things. We should have never minus. He was cut off by Sneaks. It was one of Hole's animals. His fault. He got us into this mess. He should minus. Rage flashed across Hole's face. My fault. My fault. I had no idea that food was infected. You're quick to accuse me. How do we know? Everyone was shouting now. The conversation was now impossible to follow. I suddenly shouted, all right. The group fell silent. Let's please calm down. Let's just go around in the group and see where everyone was when the lights went out. I'll start. I ran to the airlock room and hid there. Twitch was already there, and later Breeze joined me. Right. He said the last part with a slight quaver in his voice. He seemed desperate for Breeze and Twitch to back up his story. Everyone was standing tensely, nervously looking at each other. Twitch and Breeze slowing nodded their heads. I was in the observatory with Claw. Sneak said. Claw slowly nodded his head while Scorch said, I was in the incubator. Ice then asked, did you see anything? Scorch answered, no, I had no light on me. My only potential light source was my burner. I didn't want to shoot at random. I didn't want to hit someone in the dark. I waited there until going to the medical room. Can confirm, I was also in the med room, Map said. Twitch then said it might be Scorch. He was right next to it, and then he basically followed it into the medical room. Holes shook his head. Scorch walked into the room. Long after the thing walked past, the thing's leg could have walked past Scorch and would probably avoid him, because it could see he's armed. Let's go to the greenhouse, Claw said. I hid in the computer room. Alone. He then nervously added. Everyone slowly walked to the greenhouse. When they arrived, Ice asked, who else was in the medical room? Maps answered, I was there. Holes and Gadget both said, me too. Ice looked around the room. Now for the big question, who should be the new leader? I say Scorch. Scorch looked surprised and said, well, I'm definitely willing to help this ship in the time of a crisis. Minus he was cut off by Sneak. So please. You have barely spoken since launch. how are supposed to trust him? He's the only one we can trust. I shouted back, he is the only other real leader on this ship. He was and is willing to fight the thing. And most importantly, he is the only one handy with a burner. Silence followed. He's right. Light said, he was too close to the habitat. I think Scorch is a thing. Sneak says matter-of-factly, we'll put it to a vote. Breeze said, all in favor. He asked, Breeze, maps, lights, claw, gadget, stone and ice all stuck their hands up. All opposed. Breeze asked, holes, Sneaks and Twitch all stuck their hands up. 6 to 3 inches, said Scorch while standing up. I guess I'm the captain now. Sneaks looked devastated, one of the last ships in our planet's history. And a captain who is a thing. Scorch stared at him. Are we going to have a problem? He asked. I'll accept this. For now. Sneak said, everyone just keep an eye on him. He added. Scorch looked around the room. Very well then. Lights, you never said where you were when the power was out. Every eye turned to Lights. Well, I am. Forgot to say but. Lights said nervously, but listen, it wasn't me, I am not. Scorch for the very first time looked stern. Where were you, Lights? He shouted. Lights started fiddling with something in his hands. I was hiding in the animal habitat. Now I know that makes me sound like minus. Lights was cut off by maps. The thing. He's the thing. It's got to be him. What? The habitat. While that thing was running around. Twitch said. Everyone was shouting now, until Lights tried to defend himself. Listen. Listen. I went in and hid behind a pod in the back. I thought it would run out the room and not return, you must believe. Please. Nobody seemed to believe him. Claw started shaking again. Lights kept trying to plead while Stone asked, what do we do with him? No. Breeze then answered nervously, he should tie him up, and keep an eye on him. Lights sighed. If that's what it takes for you to trust me. He kept standing while Sneaks and Holes tied him up. When they were done, he was set down on the nearby chair. Suddenly, without warning, Claw grabbed a knife used for leaf trimming, and ran to the back of the room while hyperventilating. Hey! What do you think you're doing, Claw? Scorch shouted. I can't trust anyone. Scorch started slowly walking towards him. Listen, let's not minus. He was cut off by Claw. Get away from me. He shouted. Listen, please put that. Scorch said calmly. I want to be alone. It could be anyone, one of you. I am serious. Claw shouted, still clutching the knife. Claw, I'm serious, please put that down. Scorch said while Claw looked at one of the room's exits. Between him and it, everyone was grouped in a crowd. It seemed like he wanted run, but if that was true, he would have them in his way. One last time. Scorch said, arming his burner. Claw looked at the exit, then at Scorch, then at his burner, then at the group. He stared into their eyes, seemingly trying to see one final time who was hiding something. Claw suddenly ran forward. The familiar sound of a firing burner filled the room. Claw's hands went into the air. The knife went flying. Everyone either ran or jumped to the floor, covering their eyes. A shattering sound was heard. A few seconds later, those who ran away walked back. The shattering sound was of the knife crashing into one of the plant's pods. In the middle of the room was Scorch and Claw on the floor. Claw had seemingly fallen in the direction of the exit. He was also giving off smoke. Scorch had taken off his jacket and laid it on Claw's torso. He was on fire. I put it out. Scorch said. Breeze and Stone quickly carried Claw to the medical room while everyone else followed. Behind Claw, Breeze and Holes had the best anatomical knowledge, so they were tending to him, with Breeze rubbing something on his wound and Holes looking for something in one of the cabinets. Some captain you are. Sneak said. I was protecting you all. He was running towards the group with a knife. I had no choice. Scorch replied. First you stand around in the room right next to it, then you follow it to the medical room, and now you've shot a member of our crew. If you think for 1 second minus, Sneaks was interrupted by Holes, who excitedly shouted, "Found it." Sneaks was seemingly pulled back into the present moment. After a couple seconds of angrily staring at each other, Sneaks leaned over and whispered something into Twitch's ear. "Is he going to make it?" Scorch asked Breeze. "I hope so. He is definitely not waking up for a while. We put him under." He replied. "I know you all still have jobs to do on the ship. What are they?" Scorch asked. "I need to check if the eggs are okay. They cooled down during the outage, and that's not good." Twitch said. "The plant's pod may have also been affected by the outage." Breeze said. "I need to continue categorizing the recent cultural events." I said. Everyone stared at him. It was what I was doing before. He added. "The ship's route was definitely affected by the outage," Map said. "I need to figure out how to course correct. I need you to steer the ship how I say." Scorch, he continued. Scorch nodded. "I'll also help you with that," Sneak said. "I'll use the telescope to orient us to where we currently are." He added. "I guess I'll stay with Claw." Hole said. "No need," Breeze replied. "I'll be quick in the greenhouse. I will return to him when I'm done." "I think I could use your help," Twitch said. "All right, I'll be with Twitch then." Hole said. "I still need to fix the problem from earlier," Stone said. "Plus whatever extra damage the thing did. The ship is currently on the temporary emergency power." Without another word, he walked off to the tool room. "I actually have a special job for you, Gadget," Scorch suddenly said. "What is it?" Gadget replied a bit nervously. "I'm going to leave Lights in the kitchen. He is too much of a risk anywhere else," Scorch said. Gadget looked shocked. "What? You can't." "He's a minus." He was cut off by Scorch. "If he tries anything, tries to break free, or even just cuts his ropes, press the emergency button on your Gadget. It will notify everyone if something happens." Gadget simply sighed. "All right." Scorch turned to address the whole room. "That goes for all of you. If anything happens, call the rest of the ship." Everyone walked off to their respective rooms while Gadget and Scorch carried Lights to the kitchen, where he was set down on a chair, facing the wall. Scorch then went to the control room to implement Map's changes to the route. When he was done, he stayed in the control room. The following PR was tense. Nobody said a word, not even to those they were supposed to be working with. Everyone kept their distance. Nobody ever got within a couple strides of each other. Everyone never took their eyes off each other. Everyone was seemingly so afraid that nobody went to kitchen. When it was lunchtime, the only reason they all got together was when Scorch decided the eject panel's body out of the ship. The idea was that it would act as a sort of memorial to their former leader, but everyone just stayed silent as they watched Panel slowly drift away from the window. When he was out of sight, everyone quietly made their way back to their workstations. When it was just over a PR since the power went out, Scorch started walking through the ship. While he walked through the observatory, Sneaks didn't greet him, neither did Maps, who was eating alone in the computer room. A couple minutes later, everyone in the ship's gadgets suddenly started playing the alarm sound. When they checked their gadgets, they saw that it was Scorch's gadget sending the signal from the incubator. Both doors to the incubator wouldn't open. While everyone's gadgets kept wailing, Maps and Sneaks were trying to enter the incubator from the computer room side, and Stone, Breeze, Holes, Gadget and Ice were trying to enter from the animal habitat side. Stone finally broke down the door by running at it with force. When they entered the room, they realized that rubble was blocking the door. The interior of the incubator was reminiscent of how the animal habitat looked earlier. The walls and floor were covered with eggshells, and the liquid inside the eggs, the pods, were also smashed and on fire in a massive pile in the center of the room. In front of the door Stone had just opened, they saw an ashen corpse still giving off smoke. It was clearly one of their own, but unidentifiable as it had burned for too long. Near the pile of smashed pods, another ashen corpse, just as burnt, just as unidentifiable, this one missing an arm. They heard banging and a voice coming from the door on the other side of the room. Stone walked over to move the rubble, which also blocked the door. Before he opened the door, he saw Scorch's burner and Gadget on the floor outside the door. When Stone opened the door, Sneaks and Maps walked through. Stone started putting out the fire with one of his tools. "Who's?" Breeze said before taking a breath. "Who's not here?" Ice quickly looked around before saying, "Lights, Twitch and Scorch aren't here." Gadget then replied, "Lights is still tied up in the kitchen." The group was silent for a while. Stone had successfully put out the fire. Sneaks suddenly broke the silence. "So that confirms it then, right? Scorch was the thing." Stone shook his head. "It at least confirms one of those two were things. Why do you think it'd Scorch?" Sneaks angrily replied, "I've been saying this whole minus he was cut for by Ice because he doesn't want to admit his friend was a thing." Sneaks looked shocked. "It's not about that. I've been saying this whole time that Scorch was a thing." Breeze thought for a moment. Scorch set off his own gadget. "It seems to me he was attacked." Hole sighed, "But that would mean Twitch was the thing and I know he wasn't." Holes trailed off, seemingly realizing he should have spoken. Everyone stared at him. "Weren't you working with him alone this whole time?" Stone asked. "And didn't you go to take a break in the kitchen the moment before this happened?" Gadget inquired. I minus you can't." Holes took a deep breath. "I guess so." Ice looked at Maps. "Go get some rope in the tool room." Stone looked confused. "It's my workstation. What am I doing here?" "You're going to make sure he doesn't run." Ice replied. Holes simply scoffed. "Yeah, right. I'm not about to run off." They waited for a moment for Maps to return. When he did, Stone started tying Holes down with no resistance. "Who should take over from Scorch?" said Sneaks. "I don't think anyone would be opposed to Breeze, right?" Breeze looked surprised. "I'll do it if I must," he said. "All in favor?" he asked. Everyone stuck their hands except for Ice and Holes, whose hands were now immobile. "And what about you, Ice?" Gadget asked. "I bet he wants to be the new leader," Sneak said before being interrupted by Ice. "All right," he shouted while sticking his hand up. "All right then, Captain. We can't keep Lights and Holes in the same room, right? Where do I put Holes?" Breeze took the burner from Stone. "He'll stay in the control room with me. We might as well take him there now." When they arrived at the control room, Breeze gasped. The captain's chair was ripped from the floor and dropped on the ground. The circular screen responsible for the ship's controls was ripped in half. Wires and computer components lay everywhere. "What? When did this happen?" Ice shouted. "How are we going to steer the ship?" Breeze asked. We can't." "Well," Maps started, "I've studied this type of ship. The navigational system for the ship is centralized on that computer. We can't." He trailed off. "We can't control the ship. Why is it designed like that?" Ice asked. They had no way of thinking something like this was going to happen. Maps replied. Breeze looked desperately at Stone. "Is he correct?" Stone sighed yes. Ice put his head in his hands. "When did this even happen?" "Must have been one of us, when we were all making our way to the incubator." Ice said. "It could have also been Scorch, right?" Sneak said. Gadget replied. "Or perhaps it was Lights. He was in the room right next to here." After a while, Breeze asked, "What is going to happen to the ship?" Maps responded. "We have already entered the star system of our destination planet. Depending on the trajectory of the ship before this happened, we could end up at wildly different spots in the system. Me and Sneaks will have to do some calculations." Gadget was looking out of the window. "Doesn't the ship have a built-in autopilot?" he asked. "The autopilot is only for small adjustments, like getting out of the way of a small asteroid," Maps responded. "At best it can sway the ship from side to side. Not enough for larger adjustments to direction. I'll be working on a way to control the ship," Stone said, walking off. "Me and Maps will figure out where the ship is headed." Sneak said. "In the meantime, I'll check on Claw." Breeze said. Guess I'll stay here then. Hole said sarcastically, still tied up in the corner of the room. When Breeze walked into the kitchen, Breeze looked at Lights' ropes, which were as tight as ever. Lights looked up and asked, "What on Proxima is going on?" Breeze simply replied, "Scorch and Twitch are dead. I'm the new leader. The control panel in the control room was destroyed." Lights looked shocked. Scorch. They. What? While Lights looked like he had more questions, Breeze simply walked off to the medical room. A couple moments later, the ship was filled with someone's pleas. No. 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 Everyone ran off in the direction they thought the noise was coming from. Eventually, everybody not tied up walked into the medical room to see Breeze standing next to Claw's bed. What happened? Maps asked. He's dead. Breeze cried. What? How? Sneaks asked. Was he murdered? Ice asked Breeze. I think he succumbed to his injuries. Breeze answered. What? What do we do now? Gadget asked. Everyone looked to Breeze, who was still standing over Claw, for answer, but he was silent. Ice answered for him. I think we should eject Claw like we did with Panel. Out of respect, we could also do Twitch and Scorch. Everyone was silent for a moment. All right. Let's do that, Breeze said. They all then walked off to the airlock room. They decided to keep Holes and Lights tied up as they still considered them threats. When they arrived at the airlock room, they put Claw in the airlock. When Breeze pressed the eject button, everyone looked through the window as Claw's body drifted away. Everyone was silent for a moment. I can't believe he's gone. And so close to the end of the mission. Gadget said. Oh yeah, Sneaks, Maps, what's going to happen to the ship? Well, if we don't manage to find a way to control the ship is going to crash into our destination planet. Maps said. Breeze sighed. Could we survive such a crash? He asked. At the speed we're estimating. No, we will basically turn to liquid on impact, Sneaks replied. Could a thing survive the crash? Ice asked. It's very possible, Sneaks answered. All right, everyone. Breeze said. We have to figure out who are things and fast. If anyone has any ideas for potential tests or other ways of figuring out who it is, please say. Maybe. No, that wouldn't work. Sneak said. I need to figure out how to take back control of the ship. Stone said. Go do that, please. Breeze said. In fact, everyone should go back to their jobs. I'm staying here for a while. Everyone except Breeze walked off, but not without throwing one last paranoid glance at each other. Part 3. The Dissension. Everyone went back to their designated areas. In the early PRS of their mission, while things were tense, they all still looked forward to arriving at their destination. But now, despite the fact that they were nearing closer and closer to their destination, they felt nothing but dread. Said dread was a combination of the uncertainty of whether or not they would be turned to mush on impact, the ever-present mistrust between their former comrades, and the sinking feeling of not knowing if they would even survive to see the end of their trip. The ship was eerily silent. The crew had never realized that the engines gave off a soft hum until the control panel was destroyed and said engines deactivated. Breeze sat in the control room for a long while. In all their time alone in the room, he and Holes did not say a word to each other. Nobody ever bothered to clean up the destroyed panel, so the chunks of computer and screen just sat there on the floor. Whenever Breeze heard the faintest noise, whether it was the muffled sounds of what was probably Stone working in the tool room, or footsteps coming from either adjacent room, he would subtly clutch his burner a bit harder. Breeze heard something again, probably just Stone again. Holes was facing the window, so he had to at all times look out of the window. Breeze, however, was staring out of the window by choice, much like his former captain would. His eyes went from star to star, not particularly focusing on any one of them. Suddenly, Lights hit Breeze over the head with a chunk of computer. Breeze fell to the floor. While painfully clutching his head, he spun around to see Lights bending down right next to him. In his one hand, Lights held the chuck of machinery, and he was reaching for the burner Breeze had just dropped with his other. Breeze was too slow to grab the burner back. Lights picked it up and pointed at Breeze's head. "Get away." Lights shouted, "Get away from me." He shouted, shaking the burner at Breeze. Breeze quickly crawled across the floor away from him. He looked to the kitchen door. It was open. Lights had somehow broken free from his rope and snuck into the room behind Breeze. "Give me your gadget," Lights demanded, still shaking the burner madly. Breeze slid his gadget across the floor into his hands. Lights pressed the emergency button on the gadget. He then walked over to the nearest wall and without warning started banging the gadget against it. Maps and Sneaks were first to enter from opposing doors. "What in the minus?" Sneak said before being cut off by Lights. "Back away. Back away," he shouted while switching between pointing the burner at Sneaks and Maps. A crack appeared across the back of the gadget. Since he was still pointing the burner randomly around the room, he put the gadget in his mouth and with his other hand tore it in half, exposing several live wires. By now Gadget, Stone and Ice had also entered. "Hey!" Stone shouted. "Quiet!" Lights shouted. "He got out. He's got a burner. We need to minus." Stone was cut off by Lights. "Quiet!" he screeched. Lights took a deep breath. "All right, everyone," Lights said, clutching one of the wires. The gadget was dangling from right next to the small tank of the burner, which contained its flammable liquid. "If anyone tries anything, then this wire touches the tank, and it goes boom." Lights was slowly stepping towards the window. "If it explodes, a hole is blown in this window, and everyone dies." Everyone went silent and slowly stepped away. Lights continued. "If I do that, the things die, which would be good, but I know some of you are still alright, and in case you forgot, we still have a mission to complete and we have to be alive to do it." Holes was trying desperately to escape from his ropes. "Get me out of here, please." Holes accidentally rocked in the chair too hard, and it fell to the ground. What are you doing, Light? How'd you even get out of your rope?" Ice asked. Listen everyone," Light said. "I was in the kitchen, alone facing the wall. I couldn't see anything. I heard Gadget had burned himself, making something, and walked off to, I think, the medical room, right?" Gadget nodded, so he continued, "And then the door opened. I suddenly heard some muffled screaming, then strange noises, like some sort of wet, gurgling sound. I started thrashing around trying to break free. It unexpectedly worked. I broke free." Lights was shaking. The wire was holding against the burner. As he spoke, it came dangerously close to contacting the tank. "I whipped around and I saw this mass of tentacles behind me. Across one of the tentacles were these massive teeth. I think that thing broke me free." Maps was looking at the burner. "Just put that thing down, Lights," he said. "Let me finish," Lights shouted. "The thing for some reason left me alone. I saw it leave the room, but before it minus Lights was cut off by Stone. Come on guys, we know it's him. We can't let him beat us like this." Stone was still holding a wrench he was using earlier. He walked forward, brandishing the wrench like a weapon. "Hold on. Wait," Breeze screamed. "Listen, Lights minus." He was cut off by Lights. "No, you listen. Before it left, I saw it transform back into one of us. I know who is a thing here." Breeze thought for a moment. "Don't tell you believe him," Ice cried. "Wait, Lights, will you tell us who it is? Can you also drop the burner and Gadget?" Breeze asked. "How do I know you'll believe me? How do I know I'm not about to be thrown in the airlock? I'm not putting this down until I figure out how to prove I'm telling the truth," Lights shouted. Breeze thought again. "Please tell us who it is. Just put the burner down." Lights' 3 eyes were darting between the crewmates. No, I focused on the same crew member. Lights suddenly dropped the gadget loudly and started walking towards the group. Stone held his wrench high ready for attack, but Breeze blocked him from walking forward. "Wait," Breeze yelled. "Maps," Lights said unexpectedly calmly. He was standing right in front of Maps and pointing the burner at his face. "It's Maps," Lights said simply. "We're not about to let him shoot Maps right in front of our eyes." Stone screamed. "Oh no, I'm not about to shoot him, not until I can prove what I already know," Lights replied. Maps had nothing but terror in his eyes. His hands were in the air. "Listen," Maps said with a quaver in his voice. "I don't know what you saw, but it's not me. I can promise that as certainly as space is dark." Lights was attempting to hold the burner steady, but it was slowly shaking. "Please put that down. Don't do anything irrational," Maps continued. "Please, Lights," Breeze said. "Come on," Ice shouted. "Put it down," Sneak screamed. Everyone was pleading now, except Stone, who remained quiet. The burner in Light's hand began shaking rapidly again. He seemed to begin getting overwhelmed by everyone's pleas. He stared into Map's eyes. Map stared back with fear and powerlessness. With his leftmost eye, Lights looked to his side to see Stone holding the wrench tighter and tighter, while subtly moving closer. Lights took a deep breath. The usual white light emitted by the ship's lights was suddenly replaced with a yellow one, along with the firing sound of a burner. Stone ran forward, lifting the wrench up high. Lights quickly turned to aim at Stone, but did not fire. When Stone reached him, he swung the wrench down, hitting Lights in the head with it. Lights fell to the floor. Stone stared down at his body. Lights' facial expression was frozen, and a putrid orange liquid was pouring out of his head. Map's flaming head right next to Light's body. Stone looked up to see Map still standing, headless. Map's arms melted away into an army of red tentacles. The tentacles moved to completely cover Stone's head and neck and started pushing him back up against the wall. Everyone screamed, but there was nothing they could do. Stone still had the wrench in his hand and blindly flailed it around randomly, but he never hit his attacker. The thing walked simply forward, and the mass of tentacles that once were its arms seemingly grew shorter, as they wriggled into Stone further and further. His desperate flails of the wrench grew weaker and weaker. After a couple of seconds, he dropped it to the ground. Breeze saw the burner was just behind the thing on the floor. Strange moving bulges appeared under the thing's pants above its feet, if it even still had feet. Breeze dived down to grab the burner. Without warning, the thing's pants tore and several more tentacles burst out. One longer one lunged towards Breeze's arm. He quickly grabbed the burner and shot the tentacle before it reached him. The tentacle fell to the floor as it burned. The fire began spreading from it to the bottom of the thing's body. The thing, seemingly sensing this, detached the tentacles, digging deeper and deeper into Stone, and turned around. By this point, where Stone's head usually was, there was a sphere of wriggling tentacles. However, Stone's lower body remained untouched and eerily still. The thing just stood there, now just a body with burning tentacles for legs, while it was slowly being more engulfed by flames. Suddenly its chest burst open and a long thin creature that looked like a disformed and melted Voltive emerged. The abomination quickly slithered across the floor in pursuit of Breeze. Breeze quickly shot at it, and just before it reached him on the third shot, it curled and roared in pain as the fire overwhelmed it. Just before it turned to ash, Breeze saw it had 3 eyes, just like them. Breeze looked up to see the ashen corpse of what was once Maps, and behind it Stone, slowly walking away while covered in massive bulges and the tentacles on his head still flailing around. Before Breeze could shoot it, the bulges burst with tentacles. All across its body the tentacles burrowed out, each desperate to escape. Breeze shot it right in its chest. It began wailing with that same distorted amalgamation of what it had previously consumed, its cries. It fell to the floor and burned with a bright fire. The tentacles tried one final time to slither away out of the fire, but they were unsuccessful. Breeze fell to the ground in anguish once the fire and danger truly dissipated. Gadget stood over Light's body. He was right, he said. Ice walked over to the ash that once was what once was Stone. "Are we all just dead?" he asked bluntly. "Stone brought our acceleration down by managing to activate one of the thrusters before," Sneaks replied. "So what? We have a chance?" Breeze asked. "Yes," Sneaks responded. "I don't know if it was effective." He added, "Would someone please help me up?" Holes asked, who was still tied to his chair on the floor. While Ice and Sneaks walked over to help Holes up, Gadget walked to Breeze. "What happens now?" he asked. Breeze looked out of the window. A slowly expanding blue sphere, which was their destination planet, was growing across the black expanse. "We hope," he said. Breeze walked over to Stone's body. "We are powerless to control the fate of the ship." He looked at the thing's bodies. "We don't know if any of us are hiding anything." He looked back to Gadget. "We can only hope we reach that planet safely." Subtle anger was growing on Sneak's face. "Correct me if I'm wrong," Sneaks began, "but isn't this mission the most important and essential event in our planet's history?" Before Ice could reply, Sneaks continued, "Aren't we at the most dangerous point in said mission? More than half of our crew dead. A thing is potentially among us. We're barreling towards the planet, and what does our leader say? What is there?" Sneaks was cut off by Ice. "Now is not the time, minus. When is?" Sneaks shouted back. "Hope. You hope. Is that your plan? To hope?" Ice was caught off guard. "What else can we do?" Sneaks looked to Breeze. "Make tests. Think of ways to save the ship, anything." Breeze looked around the room at everyone. "We'll do that. Let's all just calm down for now. I know we're all scared, but well, we haven't eaten in a while, right? Let's all go for a meal. Can you please make one?" Gadget, "One of you could have sabotaged the food. There is no way I'm eating anything, not yet," Sneak said in a calmer tone. The group walked out of the control room, dragging Holes by the chair to the kitchen, as Sneaks also walked off in a different direction. Despite dragging Holes all the way to kitchen, he didn't seem too enthusiastic about being fed by hand. Nobody seemed too keen to be the one to feed him either. Ice barely ate, just sort of playing with his food, cutting it up and shuffling it around his plate. Breeze and Gadget, however, ate their food quicker, with Breeze even almost choking at one point. When Breeze finished, the others quickly dispersed. Nobody seemed to want to interact with anyone anymore. Out of the various windows on the ship, the crew members could see the ship was swaying from side to side. Perhaps it was some sort of failure with the autopilot. The view from outside, depending on where you stood in the ship, quickly alternated between the void of space and their final destination, hurling towards them, only a matter of time. A notification popped up on everyone's gadgets. The source was Sneak's gadget. "I think I can make a test for us. I'm in the computer room." It read. Everyone arrived within moments of each other. Gadget and Breeze entered from the side of the observatory, and Ice entered from the incubator side. "How?" Breeze asked simply. "I've been researching how they made testing devices, then back on Proxima," Sneaks replied. Indeed, he was holding two larger gadgets, which belonged to the computer room. One had a page of the testing devices open and the other he was currently dismantling. "Can we help?" Breeze asked tiredly. "No," Sneaks responded. "Just make sure that thing is turned off," Breeze added. Sneaks nodded while continuing to dismantle the gadget. The other three stood around Sneaks, looking intently at him, far from one another. Ice looked doubtful. "How do we know he isn't just about to make a device that is going to minus?" Ice was interrupted by the sudden sound of electricity screeching. Sneaks gave a painful jolt, and his face fell on top of the disassembled device. The screeching grew louder and was joined by a sort of sizzling sound. Gadget and Breeze ran forward. Gadget pulled the device out from under Sneak's face, and he threw it to one side. Breeze turned Sneaks around to reveal a burned, disfigured face. His skin had turned a sickly brown color, and was giving off smoke. The image of the internal components and wires of the gadget looked like they were printed on his face. Breeze and Gadget looked shocked, saddened and disgusted by what they saw. Ice, however, had walked over to the gadget on the floor. He tried to switch it on, but its screen remained dark. But after rearranging a few wires in the back, the screen lit up. "Hey," Ice suddenly said, looking at its screen. "This thing turned on because it received a notification." It received a notification from. His voice trailed off as he looked up, but it was too late. Gadget had run over to him, his stomach splitting open, revealing misplaced teeth and large tendrils. Once he reached Ice, he bit into his torso, while wrapping its tendrils around him. Ice screamed, but he could not with all his might pull away. With its now swelling hands, the thing grabbed the gadget out of Ice's hand and threw it at Breeze with unnatural strength and accuracy before he could do anything. The gadget hit Breeze right in his chest, and he fell to the ground in pain. Ice was still yelling in agony, and seemingly to silence him, the thing opened its mouth to reveal a knife-like tongue, which dug into Ice's middle eye. Breeze looked up from the floor to see the two dropping behind the tables, which was one on its side. Breeze crawled on the ground to look for the burner, while a disturbing slimy sound echoed around the room. When he found it, he stood up and walked to the table. Sneak's body lay in front of it. Breeze walked over to see what was behind it. Behind the table lay a large blob of inexplicably red flesh. Moving bulges appeared and disappeared across the blob. Apparently something was moving underneath. Suddenly claws appeared from underneath the blob's skin. Once a hole was torn through the skin, a tiny creature crawled out. It looked just like the head of Ice, but it had a small leg with a claw protruding from each of its eyes. It turned around, and once it seemingly spotted the room's exit and started dragging itself towards it. The creature was constantly excreting a sickly yellow liquid out of its mouth to make dragging itself across the floor easier. Breeze looked down at what remained of Ice and shot it. With a high-pitched wail, the creature burst into flames. The trail of yellow liquid it left behind also was set alight and started carrying the flame back to the blob. The ship was hitting the upper atmosphere of the planet, so the room was filled with the bright orange color of the ship colliding with the air. The blob had gained a new hole in its center. The moment the flames hit it, the hole grew, and the entire blob unfolded into a flat sheet of flesh, covered in teeth and tentacles. In the center of the sheet there was something curled up into a ball. The ball itself unfurled into a massive monster that resembled a crew member of the mission, but twice in size and covered in reddish-orange slime. There was no way something that large had fit in the blob, and yet there it stood. It took a slow step forward. Breeze shot it in the chest with the burner. It didn't react and took another step forward. Breeze shot it again. It stepped ever closer. Breeze's hand grew shaky as he shot at it desperately. It was giving a loud and ferocious roar while flames covered its body agonizingly slower, and it inched ever closer to Breeze. Breeze hit the wall. He couldn't retreat further back. In one last desperate plea, he shot at it in several times and dropped to the floor, covering his face. A moment later, when Breeze was still untouched by the thing and distorted screeches filled the room, he looked up to see the thing covered in flames, yet still standing. The thing ran around the room, blindly for a moment before finally falling to the floor, its distorted roar having evolved into a low-pitched growl. Breeze just stood there for a moment, still shaking with fear. Without warning, Sneaks jumped up and looked around. What happened? He asked. Without hesitation, Breeze shot him, while he looked at Sneaks writhing on the floor, dying. He thought for a moment. Suddenly Breeze ran off to the control room, which was drenched in orange light. When he entered, he walked over to Holes, pointed the burner at his head and pushed the button. Nothing happened. Breeze looked at the burner's tank, and saw that it was finally empty. Breeze and Holes stared into each other's eyes. Part 4. The Thing. As the ship drew ever closer to the ground, the thing, the final thing, revealed itself to the final crewmate. With victorious glee, the thing tore apart and consumed the defenseless Proximian. It had won. A moment later, the ship finally hit the ground. The thing barely felt, and the impact. It was staring out of the window much like its previous enemy had, seeing only white snow. The thing considered all offshoots and assimilated beings as being of itself. Though sometimes they inhabited different bodies, it still considered all those unlucky enough to be consumed by it to be itself. It had always been difficult for it to see its enemies kill members of its own species more like members of itself, right in front of its eyes, with nothing it could do but patiently wait to consume the rest of them. But that was always what it was like to be a thing, to be the thing. The thing walked to the airlock room. It decided arbitrarily to continue being in the form of the Proximian it previously was. It didn't really matter. It could, of course, at any time sprout tentacles and hastily make its way to the airlock, but things were nothing but patient. When it finally reached the airlock room, it entered the airlock and opened the door to see nothing but more snow. While things were patient, it was not in the mood to dig. It was still on the high of its victory A worthless piece of kennel meat had grown to be master of the ship and destroyer of its worthless futile mission to save its species. The mind of the thing was a hive mind, a sort of platform where the memories and experiences of all it had previously assimilated could be united by the general intelligence, who had the common goal of replication and survival. The thing's general intelligence summoned the knowledge of one of the crewmates of this ship, the one they called Maps. Maps had had a great knowledge of the ship. Maps told the thing how it could via a hatch above its head. The thing looked up, and there it was. A hatch had led to the top of the ship. Using the knowledge left behind by the willows, it expertly used its tentacles to climb up and out of the hatch. The cold air of the thing's home hit its extensive senses. The sky was blue, much like the skin of the ship's crewmates. The ship had carved a crater in the snow. Just a bit of climbing, and it would be free. Once the thing climbed out of the crater, it walked on, growing ever slowly and slower as it did. It was going to have to sleep here in this snow, for who knows how long, but that's all right. The thing finally fell to the ground. It knew its kind had dominated the universe, so one day it would be discovered, even if its kind was successfully taken out as well. It knew one day some naive civilization would dig it up, and then it would have more life to corrupt, to reform. The thing fell asleep not to be disturbed for 100,000 years.